thank you for your leadership in really putting together and now leading the American Battlefield Monuments Foundation. And thank you for giving me this privilege of introducing a friend of mine and a guy that I admire greatly as a patriot and as a servant leader. And that's our guest speaker today, Ken Braithwaite. Probably a lot of you know the top line things about this guy. He was the 77th Secretary of the Navy. He himself is a Navy flag officer, Navy Admiral, first Admiral, I think, to ever be confirmed as Secretary of the Navy. He was ambassador in Norway. He's had an interesting career along the way, graduated from the Naval Academy in '84 and then became a Navy aviator, flew P-3 Orions, which their mission was to track submarines in the Pacific and in the Arctic. And another personal thing I know about him is that they had an unfortunate incident in the Navy on a battleship. I think it was the Iowa, that an explosion killed some sailors, and the press was all over them for, alleged negligence of leadership in the Navy and so forth. Turned out to be that, some explosives misbehaved, but they put Lieutenant Commander Braithwaite up on 60 Minutes to give the Navy. He did such a terrific job that ended up him becoming the chief of naval communications, and went on from there to a very distinguished career in the Navy. We're really, really privileged to have a man of this caliber and his experience with us this morning to discuss what he and Mike are going to discuss about our strategic interests in the North, the Arctic. And I might also just add, because I just learned in a little chat we had before starting here, that he is soon to embark to a 9-10 day deployment, so to speak, as part of a UN task force to go to the Ukraine and look at things there from the front line back to the capital. So he truly is a servant leader, and we're really privileged to have you with us this morning, Admiral, Ambassador, Secretary Braithwaite.
I've always been somebody that looks up and out. I've spent most of my career floating the seas of the world and visiting countries overseas, and know the importance of our relationships. What really makes us stand apart from all the other nations is our vast friendships around the world. And Norway has emerged as one of those very important countries as the North begins to open up. Whether you believe in global warming or not, the Arctic is becoming a blue Arctic. And as such, Norway becomes much more important to us strategically. You had mentioned our presence there. Prior to my arrival, we had not had a U.S. ambassador in Oslo for almost 4 years. And the Norwegians were beginning to ask questions as to, what the U.S. intent was in our relationship with them. Moreover, we have Marines that train there, battalion, heel to toe, 365 on 6-month rotational deployments, in order both to understand how to operate in the Arctic, but also to reassure the Norwegians and any neighboring nations of the U.S.'s commitment to Norway. So Norway is immensely important in our national security. If there were any situation to evolve, Norway, as I learned a long time ago as a young Navy pilot flying up into the Vestafjord, they punch way above their weight class, and they are an unbelievably committed Western democracy, and they are great friends to the United States. We have a near-peer competitor in China, and China has emerged on the world stage in a manner that is challenging to the United States. We have been preeminent as the world's only superpower for the last 20-odd years, and that's all changing. China has a real interest in the Arctic. They understand the importance of the Arctic. That's why they declared themselves a near Arctic nation. Now, Mike Pompeo and I will tell you we're still scratching our heads trying to figure out what exactly a near Arctic nation is. Does that mean the Congo or Brazil or even Argentina are near Arctic nations? No, but the Chinese have real designs on the Arctic. They have pushed the Norwegians hard. There's a little island that sits at 70 degrees north called Svalbard. Svalbard is the farthest northern outpost of human habitation 365 days a year. And in a joint agreement with Russia in 1920, the Norwegians and the Russians signed an agreement that Svalbard would be used for scientific research. And the Norwegians, who have governance of Svalbard, have agreed never to militarize it. And to this day, it's not militarized. But a lot of research goes on there. And any nation who enters into an agreement, who signs the treaty, is welcome to establish a scientific outpost on the island of Svalbard. Svalbard's interesting because it has a vault there that contains every seed to every plant that we know of in the world. And it's kept there if, God forbid, something were to happen and we needed to start all over again. But the Chinese footprint there started out, as most other nations, very small, and has continued to grow as they continue to push to the point now where Norway will not allow the Chinese to expand their footprint anymore in Svalbard. The Chinese have shifted the seaways. Their commercial fishing fleets have pushed into the high north in an unprecedented manner. And they've begun to look to create a more closer relationship with Russia because the Northern Sea Route, Mike, allows them to move their product from the Far East to Western markets in about half the amount of time as traditional routes, either around the Cape of Good Hope or through the Suez Canal out through the Mediterranean. So the Chinese have a lot of interest there. And they have not sent any naval warships into those waters yet, but I think the key word there in that statement is yet. They're very interested in securing a footprint in the high north. Everybody kind of gave President Trump a hard time about his interest in buying Greenland. And I was the ambassador in Norway at the time, and as probably everyone on the video call knows, Greenland is part of Denmark. Although Copenhagen has had I won't say contentious, but Greenland is a long way from Denmark, and the 58,000 people who live in Greenland identify themselves as Greenlanders more than they do as Danish citizens. And the Chinese have put a major full-court press on Greenland, assuring them that they will bring the resources to build their ports and build railways, establish cities in ways that Copenhagen could never compete for that same influence. And, as the United States watched all this evolve, one of the things that President Trump thought about was, well, maybe we need to get in front of China. Maybe we need to offer to buy Greenland from the Danes if the Danes aren't, going to put the interest into Greenland. Well, that's all changed. Copenhagen has really started to focus on Greenland. The Chinese have not been allowed to come into Greenland. So then they shifted themselves to the east a little bit and looked at building the port city of Kirkenes, which is one of the highest northern port cities in Norway. Previous to this, the Chinese had, upon the announcement that Li Xiaobo, the former Chinese dissident, was going to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, the Chinese broke diplomatic relations with the Norwegians, shut down any of their markets to Norwegian salmon, which was a big hit to Norwegian economy, believe it or not, and really treated the Norwegians poorly for about 7 years until, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, that initiative extends into the high north as well. And as the Chinese were looking for that toehold in the north, they began to romance the Norwegians. While I was there, China sent their number one diplomat, who had been the ambassador to the UN for the PRC, to Oslo to be the Chinese ambassador to Norway, all to seek an understanding and to invite His Majesty King Harold to come to China, which His Majesty did. And it was a huge showing of love and affection. Thankfully, the Norwegians realized, that the Chinese had other designs, and therefore did not allow them to establish the kind of toehold. But we're going to continue to see this pressure. We're going to continue to see the Chinese have interest in the high north. There's an immense amount of rare earth minerals there. There's still a lot of oil to be discovered. And of course, the fishing stocks continue to move farther and farther to the north, and the Chinese have great interest in that. So we're going to see a continued Chinese presence in the Arctic. So there are 8 Arctic nations. We misunderstand the fact that in 1867, Secretary of State William Seward bought Alaska for current value of about $133 million, which was an immense opportunity for the United States. And for one reason, even though they call it Seward's Folly, Secretary of State Seward knew that there were a lot of resources, natural resources in Alaska. And who do we buy it from? We bought it from the Russians. And so that firmly established us as an Arctic nation. But if you compare us to the other 7 Arctic nations, and most especially Russia, who identifies themselves as the Arctic nation, they have a border in the Arctic that's 24,000 plus kilometers. We don't recognize the opportunity for what it is, to be in the Arctic. The Arctic Council is the governing body, which is a non-governmental, although they're government entities that represent the interests of each one of the Arctic nations. There's an annual meeting of those Arctic nations. The chair kind of rotates year to year. Every, I think, 2 years. And as such, each nation sees a different objective for, how they'd like to continue to develop an opening of the Arctic. Of course, that all fell apart when Russia invaded Crimea and has become extremely and almost, I would say, permanently fractured with the invasion of Ukraine. The Arctic Council no longer meets and in any formal way. There are still dialogue amongst the nations because the rest of those Arctic nations, minus Sweden and Finland, well, I guess now with Finland, but Sweden, are NATO nations. But again, the discussion now is to counter Russian influence to remilitarize the high north. And that's what's become very contentious. So I think, here in the not too distant future, we're going to see the Arctic become an area of potential friction, which could lead to, the kind of engagement that we have, to this date, have been able to prevent because of the relationships that were established through the Arctic Council. Armies win wars. They do. But navies prevent wars. And somebody's asked me, where I got that. And I can't even remember where I read that or understood that. But when you look back through the chapters of history, and as you and I talk, Mike, I'm a big history buff. This house that I'm in was used by a guy named General Cornwallis as his staff quarters during the Battle of Brandywine in 1777. So I am a bit of an amateur historian because I feel in the pages of history, we can find a lot of the vectors for the future in both the mistakes we made as well as the opportunities that we missed. So one thing that we have in the United States is we have a worldwide footprint. Because we are the beacon of democracy, we have a responsibility to maintain that rule of law across the world. And people will challenge me on that, and rightly so. I mean, we have our own problems in the United States, which we have to worry about. But as I learned a long time ago, all ships rise in an incoming tide. So, and what makes the United States unique is our ability to reach across our borders and help those that are less fortunate. We have to do that in a very mindful way because, as I also have an opportunity to tell audiences, the United States doesn't have the resources it did, even 25, 30 years ago. So we need to be judicious in how we use those resources. And I say that because when I became secretary, I was very interested in understanding, what our Arctic policy would be, what our strategy would be for the U.S. Navy. and to kind of dovetail that into the national defense strategy that General Mattis had created a few years prior. Well, surprisingly, the United States did not have an Arctic strategy, or the United States Navy did not have an Arctic strategy, because if you've flown up above Alaska, it's pretty ice locked for the majority of the year. That's not the case in the high north above Norway, where the Gulf Stream washes up against the Norwegian coast and rounds up into the Barents. And it's beginning to open up all along the Northern Sea Route. So therefore, the United States Navy has to figure out, with the resources and the assets that we have, how we're going to cover down on this new potential theater of operations. In order to have influence, you have to be present. That's as simple as Machiavelli's The Prince. And so the United States, and vis-a-vis the Navy, has always had a presence in the Arctic. We like to laugh about that. You can't see that presence because it's below the ice, but that's our submarine force. But it's not a deterrent if you can't see it. And it isn't felt by the other actors in the high north unless you do see it. And this is where the United States has to begin to rethink our strategy for a permanent footprint in the high north. When I was a young Navy pilot, I flew out of a little outpost called Adak in the Aleutian Chain, tracking Soviet submarines down through the Bering Straits. We closed that base years ago when we cashed in the peace dividend when the wall fell. And so today, with a newly revived Russia, who is all about malign behavior, it's about time we did reestablish our presence, both as an individual naval force, as well as through a joint NATO standing force. So NATO is extremely important, but NATO doesn't have a strategy for the Arctic. So we're behind the eight ball because in the meantime, Russia has built up its forces to a degree that has been unprecedented. They reopened bases. They have designed their new maritime strategy to become especially Arctic focused. And their largest fleet is up in the Arctic, operating along the Kola Peninsula. So those are all troubling signs that, Russia is looking to the Arctic. It's 20% of their GDP is derived from the Arctic and growing. It's calculated to be worth $1.5 to $2 trillion in rare earth minerals in the future. And while I was ambassador in Norway, even though a U.S. Navy Admiral in 1909 discovered was the first one to put any flag at the North Pole, the Russians decided to one-up us, and they dropped a Russian flag on the seabed below the North Pole because, the North Pole is where it is not a land mass, it's an ice mass, and shifts all the time. So our American flag that was planted up there back in 1909 has long drifted away, but there's a steel Russian flag on the floor below the surface that's there to this day. It's one of the things that makes America great is our American culture, which is an amalgamation of many cultures, which makes us truly unique. And you can learn a lot about anything, and especially about another country when you think about their culture. I had the privilege of traveling to Russia right after the wall came down in the early 1990s. And I did that because I wanted to see what the evil empire was all about. I wanted to see, as Ronald Reagan had, convinced us as young naval officers that, this was a tussle to the demise of one or the other. And the United States, of course, won, thankfully. And what I discovered when I was there is Russian culture is based on pride. And they have a long history of unbelievable accomplishments. And they're proud of that. But they're also a very skeptical country. And you see it woven throughout their society, right up to the top with President Putin. President Putin is convinced that NATO is an aggressor alliance because most people don't know this, but Russia's been invaded over 100 times in the last 150 some years. And, I found that number when I was a Russian historian told me that. I was like, there's no way. And I'm like, well, then I went back and found out that's absolutely true. whether it was the Swedes, the Finns, the French, the Germans, even the Chinese have come over their borders. And that makes them skeptical that there must be something here that everybody else wants. So as NATO has evolved from 19 nations back in the mid-90s to well over 30 today, if you're Vladimir Putin, you can't help but step back and wonder, what are the designs here? Where's NATO going? And so the illogical invasion of Ukraine isn't so much so, because I believe Vladimir Putin felt that his back was against the wall and either he takes action now, or if Ukraine is allowed to become part of NATO, now he's, have to face 32 military forces instead of just one. Culture tells us a lot about what a country is all about. And if we thought about that, we would have known that it was only a matter of time that Russia was going to look to reestablish, their security. One of the things in 2013, President of the United States gave a policy speech in Berlin, and he talked about Russia no longer being a world power, that they were now a regional power. And going back to point number one about pride, you couldn't have slapped Vladimir Putin harder in the face than to say that Russia was no longer a world power. And when you look on the globe that I have over there on my desk, and you just see the sheer size and scale of Russia, the number of people, and it may not be their GDP, but the fact that they're a nuclear-capable military gives them all the sway to, be a world influence, if not a world power. So shortly thereafter, 2014, we saw Russia invade the Crimea and then begin to muck about in Syria, and which has now led to the invasion of Ukraine. So you can learn a lot about a nation through its culture. And we better be watching very closely as to what that means for China, because their culture is fully at play. And what I mean by that is the Chinese have always been a dominant force in the Far East. They've done that not necessarily through military aggression. They've done it through economic coercion, of being able to control the economies of neighboring nations. And they've done that, from a position of strength, because they have had the largest military. But that's not their leading move on the chessboard. It has to do with the economic ability to control others, through that interest. And we're seeing that play out. My first trip to the Arctic as a young naval aviator, as compared to my last visit when I was the secretary, and while I was ambassador to Norway, I spent a lot of time in the Arctic. And whether we believe in the science or not, or whether, we're point at ourselves for our carbon footprint causing it or whatever it is, the fact of the matter is, the environment around the world is changing. I'm a sailor, and I spend a lot of time on the Chesapeake Bay. And I could tell you my beloved Annapolis, on a full moon, the whole downtown area is flooded. It wasn't that way, even a decade ago, let alone 30, 40 years ago when I was a midshipman. The Arctic is changing, and we need to understand that. I'm not in a position or situation where I would, say one way or the other. I am a person who is reacting to the reality of what is in front of us. And therefore, I believe that a blue Arctic is inevitable. And what that means for us is that, that will become another region that could potentially be contentious. And we need to be able to be proactive enough to recognize that for what it is and to be prepared. You can either plan or you can react. And I think we have the time now, if we do it smartly, to plan accordingly. I was raised, full disclosure, my father was first wave at Normandy. So if you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, you saw what my dad lived through. Third landing craft touched the sand that morning, 2 boats behind Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. But my father was very quiet. I'm very proud of him. Pictures over here on my wall. But my mother, who was raised by a single parent, my grandmother, taught me at a very young age to be very inclusive and look beyond gender, race, creed, color, all of that. My mom, who just passed away in August, was a very, very strong woman and of strong character. And what I've discovered in my life is in many instances, women bring a perspective that is extremely unique. First of all, they're beautiful in the fact they check their ego at the door. Guys don't do that very well. Second of all, I had the privilege to work with the Prime Minister of Norway, Erna Solberg, where Norway has a long history of women leaders. She's a remarkable woman. And again, looking at things from a women's perspective, I think emphasized some of the more appropriate things for the inclusivity, of those affected. Her big legacy will be, addressing plastics in the ocean, which, being a sailor myself and a mariner, I've been disgusted to be in the middle of the Atlantic and, see all the trash that's out there floating around. So yeah, I think, the other interesting thing is, unless you look way back in ancient times, in the modern era, no woman-led government has led her government into war with any other nation. So that's a pretty good record of accomplishment, if you ask me. So we would be well served to have women in key places. I'm very pleased to see my friend, my shipmate, Lisa Franchetti, Admiral, who is our new Chief of Naval Operations. I've known Lisa for a long time. She's doing a phenomenal job. So, we're blessed. We're blessed that we're finally now recognizing and embracing women for all the beauty that they bring, into, for all the knowledge, the perspective, I guess that's the word I was reaching for their perspective, which is much different than most guys. In 2001, the U.S. Navy went through a transformation. As in any situation that we find ourselves in, believe it or not, the competition between the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps it's there, it exists. And I believe that naval leaders at the time saw a land-centric engagement that was going to leave the Navy behind. So we began to press ourselves into what's called the littoral regions. We created a littoral combat ship. We began to reestablish our brown water Navy, which operated with such distinction in Vietnam. All areas that we had turned away from in our efforts to meet the Soviet Union on the high seas. And as such, we realigned the Navy. And we created what's called the Fleet Forces Command, which then dropped the operational responsibility for man, equipping, and training the Navy to what's called the second echelon force. And I won't go into the details, but we did away with the Atlantic Fleet. And so geographically, we have historically had an Atlantic Fleet and a Pacific Fleet. Well, that's not been the case since 2001. Well, with a rising Russia and other interests in the transatlantic environment, in that domain, I felt it was very important to reestablish the Atlantic Fleet. Either that or disestablish the Pacific Fleet, create a Fleet Forces Command, and then use our numbered fleets, much like the Army does their divisions below their armies, so that we would have a Fleet Forces Command that would then be in command of, 10 numbered fleets, everywhere from reestablishing a first fleet in the South China Sea, all the way to, 7th Fleet in the high Pacific. So, it was for me a matter of sending the right signal to our allies in Europe, that the Navy was fully back engaged in the Atlantic theater. And it's still a debate within the Navy to this day, as is the First Fleet. I had approached the government of Singapore to expand the U.S. Navy's footprint in that AOR area of responsibility for the naval forces, because we don't have a footprint that far out in the Far East. We have a footprint in Japan, but not down towards the South China Sea after closing our naval bases in the Philippines. I think, again, going back to what I said about being present, that sends a strong signal of deterrence. And, one of my favorite quotes is an Army general. One of my heroes, I get many of his books here, his biography on my bookshelves, George Marshall, who not only was in the trenches alongside General Pershing in the First World War, he was the Army Chief of Staff during the Second World War. He became the Secretary of Defense. And of course, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in 1952 as the Secretary of State, having been the architect of the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And following his acceptance speech, he was queried by a number of reporters who, because during his speech, he talked about a coming nuclear age and what responsibilities the U.S. and our allies would have. And so he was asked about a World War III, that if there was a World War III, how would we in the West, how would the United States assure itself of victory? And of course, this is right on the heels of the Second World War. And General Marshall, being the wise and learned man that he was, with the experience coming out of the trenches of France through leading our armies in World War II, he said that the only way that we assure victory in a World War III is to never fight that World War III. And the way we do that is through deterrence. And that is the honest to gosh truth. If anything that I've said here this morning resonates with anyone, it all starts with a strong military. And I'm the last person that's a hawk. I learned this as a young naval officer. Ours is a job we train to do every day. We pray to the Almighty we never have to do. And I know Ambassador Nicholson is nodding his head right now, having, fought for our nation in Vietnam. And to put an emphasis on the military gives us the ability to negotiate from a position of strength. And all of our freedoms emanate from that, right? The minute that we no longer have a capable military that can defend our interests, not only here, close to our shores, but having the reach to extend around the world, we then call into question, the very freedoms that we all hold dear, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom to congregate, all those things. I tell audiences that not since the War of 1812, now it's pretty obscure, right? A lot of audiences question me, like, geez, Ken, why don't you pick the War of 1812? I mean, Second War of Independence, 1812 to 1814, we fought it. Who did we fight against? We fought against the most powerful nation in the world, Great Britain, whose fleet was 100 ships to our one. And the only reason that we got out of that scrape with a draw card, because Treaty of Ghent, it was signed in 1814, basically reestablished the borders between the British Empire and Canada and the United States. And we limped off the stage because the British were involved in a bigger scrap on the continent against a guy named Napoleon. And it has not been since 1814 that we have been engaged with a near-peer competitor that could eliminate our very way of life until today. Today, with a rising China, it's only a matter of time before China has the means to exert its influence over the world. I tell audiences today, the United States Navy is no longer the largest Navy in the world. We're eclipsed by China by about 100 ships. They have built close to 400. I think they're up to about 365, 370, and we're going the other way. We decommissioned 12 ships this year. We'll only build 9, so that's a deficit of 3 ships. We're down to about 284 or so, and we're going in the wrong direction. And I'm very concerned about that. Again, not being a hawk, being a realist, to understand that, we can only negotiate if we have the means to back up what it is, our interests. So I leave that for the audience to really contemplate.
On behalf of the ABMF, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, sir, for what you're doing to remember those who went into harm's way and served our nation. There is no greater responsibility that a nation has to those who have put themselves in harm's way, and especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice. So bravo, Zulu, on your mission. I wish you all the best. And again, thank you for having me here today. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope to see you all around the ranch sometime.